Well, in an ongoing quest to right the wrongs that have been done against the South and the disparaging, slanderous conduct of the North against the South, ad infinitum, since it's been prior to 1860, this has been going on, I want to present some of the evidence to show how the South, again, to this day, is being slandered and the North is using defamatory language against the South in an attempt to justify its actions, not just from 150 years ago, but the decades after the war between the states and up to this present day. There's actually quite a lot more behind this than even just money, but it seems to be a battle of, even in the spiritual world, whereby you have the material money interest versus the humanitarian spiritual interest, where I'd say the humanitarian spiritual interest are more located in the South. Now, here I'm showing a picture of Abe Lincoln, as probably you've never seen before, but I think this is a more accurate depiction of him, with the money seal of the Great Northern Railroad stamped all over him. He is actually not a politician, a career politician, although today he's known as one of the greatest presidents ever. But prior to him being elected in 1860, he was primarily an attorney and a representative for the money interest of the largest industry in the North, which was the big railroads. As a matter of fact, he turned down lucrative positions in government, including a governorship that he could have had prior to being president, because he was making much more money than the salary of a governor would have given him. He was making much more money as an attorney representing the railroads. Now, of course, as president, you get other lucrative options available to you in addition to your salary. So I will not go down that trail because that's not the point of this discussion. What I'm going to bring about here is the comparison between the POW camps in the North and the South during the war between the states, or the quest for independence by the southern states. But first, we need to get into why there was a quest for independence and what the motive for the North was to stop the South from being independent. At first, the North was, okay, great, be independent. That's fantastic, because without you people in the South voting against our interest, our manufacturing interest, our railroad interest, our canal building interest, and our manufacturing and textile mill interest, that'll be just fine. But then they realized, what do we do for the revenue? Because most of the revenue that was coming into the coffers of the federal government at that time was coming from the import-export tariffs. So the New York Tribune, the paper which just before Christmas of 1860 had urged the seceding states to be allowed to leave the Union in peace, in an editorial of March 16, 1861, had this to say about the tariff and secession. If free goods, goods on which the tariff had not been paid, are allowed to enter the slave states, why is it not better to give up the contest? The editorial ended as follows: if then we have or expect to have anything that can be called a government, now is the time to be decided, energetic, effective action. In other words, not only were they afraid of losing the revenue, in other words, we got to do something. We're really going to lose the revenue from the tariff, because most of the tariff money was coming from the southern states, about 75 to 85% of it. But there was also the angle whereby, since the South was going to set up a free trade zone with a very low tariff, imports from Europe could come into the South, then be resold to the North, and still undercut the price added on differential from the high protectionist tariff that the North was imposing on European goods going into the North. So that could have still undercut them. Later on, also, the New York Times, in an editorial of March 1861, said with us is no longer an abstract question, one of constitutional construction or of the reserved or delegated power of the state or federal government, but of material existence. We are divided and confused till our pockets were touched. They weren't sure about the South seceding until they realized it was going to affect their pockets. You know, actually back in the day, in the 1860s, they wrote in a manner that probably most people today would not understand. I think today in the newspapers they have to write at the fourth grade level so most people understand what they're saying. Do not do not misconstrue or underestimate the intelligence of people back then who did not have laptops, cell phones, smartphones, and cloud computing to store their wealth of information on. They were very intelligent. So another thing here that emphasize again what the problem was that the North had with the South questing independence, because I want to preface this before I get into the issue with the POW camps, because most people today would say, well, let those Confederates suffer in the POW camps. They were fighting for slavery. I'm emphasizing they were not fighting for slavery, and the northern newspapers were saying so at the time. They were worried about losing their revenue, the revenue of the tariffs, and they're also worried about the South being a free trade zone with a low tariff, whereby goods can be brought in from Europe and then resold to the North at even lower prices than when the North would have been receiving them with the added-on tariff, protectionist tariff. So, here's another aspect. Writing in December 1861 in a British weekly publication all the year round, the famous British author Charles Dickens, who was a strong opponent of slavery, but who blamed what he termed the American Civil War on the Morrill tariff. Now, Morrill was actually the one that was heavily invested in the railroads, and he had iron works, so he was going to profit by that tariff directly. So Charles Dickens, an honest man, independent, writing in a British publication, not even an American publication. He was in Britain, right? Great Britain. He had these things to say about what was going on in America. The northern onslaught upon slavery is no more than a specious humbug disguised to conceal its desire for an economic control of the United States. Dickens further said, Union means so many millions of dollars a year lost to the South. Secession means loss of the same millions to the North. The love of money is the root of all this, many other evils. The quarrel between the North and the South is, as it stands, solely a fiscal quarrel. It's always about the money. So I just want to present that before I get into the POW camps. But first off, we also want to get into Judah P. Benjamin, a senator from Louisiana, speaking to the Senate on February 4th, 1861, shortly before the session of the Union of Louisiana, said this of the present situation with southern states leaving the Union. He was comparing it to 1776, basically. We are told that the laws must be enforced, that the revenue must be collected, the tariff, in other words, that the South is in rebellion without cause and that her citizens are traitors. You will enforce the laws, collect revenue, wring tribute from an unwilling people? In Lord North's speech on the destruction of the tea in Boston Harbor, which happened in December 1773, he proposed to close the port of Boston, just as the representative of Boston now proposes to close the port of Charleston. So he's making a comparison between the South trying to be independent in 1861 as the American colonies tried to be independent in 1776. Now, me, myself, from my father's side, I am in the Sons of the American Revolution and the Sons of Confederacy from South Carolina. Same issue. It was about independence from the British, independence from the North. It was a fiscal quarrel. Now, Judah P. Benjamin was actually in a unique position. Judah P. Benjamin was a Sephardic Jew. And this is also saying, this is a feather in the cap for Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Confederate President Jefferson Davis appointed Judah P. Benjamin as Attorney General, making him the first Jew to hold a cabinet-level office in an American government. Judah P. Benjamin also became the Secretary of War later on. Anti-Semitism was a fact of life in both the North and South during the Civil War years, but this was not the case with Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Now, you can't say the same thing about Abe Lincoln, really, okay? Near the end of the war, Benjamin, Judah P. Benjamin, privately persuaded General Robert E. Lee and other Confederate military leaders that the South's best chance was to emancipate any slave who would volunteer to fight for the Confederacy. So that was from Judah P. Benjamin. So just as a side note, you see the South, they're always making it sound like the South is this and that and all this. It is actually anti-defamatory language to the max, and I'm here to remedy this. Now, here we're getting into the nuts and bolts about Andersonville. Now, what happened after the Union accused this Confederacy of all these horrors that happened in Andersonville, which did happen, but it was not, well, we'll get into the thing. In other words, it was conditions beyond the Confederate States of American control. It is not denied that great suffering and mortality occurred, but this was due to circumstances and conditions beyond CSA control. Remember that in the state of Georgia, where Andersonville was located, that General Sherman, the Union general, was having a policy of scorched earth, destroying all the livestock, food, granary, methods of transportation, methods of food production, and food stores for everybody in the whole state. It was like everybody was starving. It wasn't just the POWs, it was the guards, it was the whole 9 yards. I'll get into this a little further and deeper, and we can compare it to the North, what was going on up there. If the death rate can be adduced as circumstantial evidence of barbarity, the rate of Confederate deaths was higher in northern POW camps than where there was an abundance of food, medicine, and shelter. The northern POW camps had a lot of food, medicine, and shelter, but the policy was not to give it to the Confederate POWs. In the Confederacy, there was no food, medicine for anybody. This is why they did not receive it. The Union POWs were given the same rations as the Confederate guards. The Union prisoners were given the same rations as the Confederate guards and soldiers. There was equal treatment in the hospitals as required by the CSA government, and the death rate of the Confederate guards was the same as the POWs. It was like everybody was in a living hell down south due to the policies of scorched earth against the entire civilian population in general. The Northern federal government did not have the same humane policy at all. They were not treating the Confederate POWs with any kind of respect at all. The exchange of prisoners was refused by the North before the issue of black Union POWs became an issue. The North tried to say that the Confederacy would not exchange prisoners because there was black Union POWs. That is a lie. They were stopped exchanging prisoners before they even had black Union POWs. So the CSA government requested that Northern doctors and medicine be sent to treat Northern POWs, and the request was denied. The Confederacy states, CSA, tried to buy supplies, including bowls and other utensils to use in feeding the Union POWs. They offered to pay the Union with cotton and gold, but the offer was directly refused by the Lincoln administration. They did not care about their own soldiers. Now here it gets even worse. The federal government, under President Lincoln, or the Union government, made medicine contraband, causing suffering and the death of Union POWs and all Southerners, military and civilians, right? There was a policy of scorched earth by Sherman, well known. Sherman's March to the Sea, and then he went through South Carolina, actually right where my family was from, and destroyed everything. Prior to the period of the greatest mortality, the CSA authorities offered to release the Andersonville POWs without exchange. Just, here, take your guys. That's what they said. Here, take your guys. We'll give them to you. But the offer was not accepted by the Lincoln administration, who told the CSA authorities, we cannot feed or care for them. Just, the hell with them. They didn't care. They would not take their own guys without exchange. The CSA says, we can't take care of these guys. They're going to die. The Lincoln refused to take their own people. Sherman's barbaric war crimes in Georgia, consisting of stealing, destroying, and burning food and food supplies, even made scarcer and scarcer and scarcer, increased suffering, mortality. The Northern press was furnished lies and propaganda by the Union, which still goes on today, from the Assistant Secretary of War Stanton and Secretary of War Stanton, and deliberate cruelties and war crimes by the South. The control of northern POW camps was transferred by Stanton and Dana to vindicative partisan criminal elements, and deliberate crimes of cruelty, torture, and murder were committed against Confederate POWs, as proven by a joint resolution of the U.S. Senate and House SR 97. This was proven. They actually wanted their guys to suffer more, the Union prisoners in the POW camps of the South, as propaganda efforts. That's the type of military you don't want to be in. Well, they're going to use you as a pawn for more of their propaganda. You almost think you're in Saddam Hussein's army versus Lincoln's army, right? Now, compare this to what happened in the North. In the North, in Hellmira, New York, known to the men incarcerated there as Hellmira, deservedly has been recognized as the worst military prison in the North. Although the Union Commissary General of Prisoners estimated that the camp would hold 8,000 to 10,000 men, the actual capacity was 5,000 men. From the first, medical personnel reported that proper facilities were lacking, and the stagnant pond inside the prison walls presented the potential for serious sanitary problems. Actually, most people died of disease versus lack of nutrition. Disease will get you disease actually, due to malnutrition, is accentuated. But when you will actually die of disease before you die of starvation. But they're kind of related, because as your body lacks the vital nutrients, you can't fight disease. But then you add in an environment that is rampant with disease, like a stagnant pool and sanitation problems, then you're going to have further problems right off the bat. Union authorities refused to recognize or try to correct these limitations. Mess facilities were also inadequate and unsanitary. This was in Hellmira, New York. Even when higher authorities received belated reports on problems like these at the camp, they did not act properly or act at all to make changes. There was no reason for the shortage of foodstuffs, because the area around Hellmira produced an abundance of crops, unlike what was going on with Georgia, where everything was being destroyed by Sherman's army. Hellmira was untouched by the war. There was an abundance of crops, and still they treated the Confederates like crap, and they had a high death rate. Rations were reduced. Prisoners were forbidden to purchase food. Now, you can actually look on Wikipedia about Hellmira prison camp, and you'll see that they set up a couple of towers whereby they sold tickets to the surrounding civilian northern population, where they charge them an admission so they could stare and gape at the starving and suffering Confederate prisoners of war from a tower on top of the prison. It was almost like they were selling tickets to a circus show. And it's pretty sick that that's what really was going on. But that's what was going on up in that area. During its existence, Hellmira held 12,122 prisoners. with a capacity of 5,000. Remember that. Secretary of War Stanton deliberately allowed Hellmira to become a death camp as a means of retaliating against Confederates for perceived mistreatment of Union prisoners in the South. Horgan also shows and states there is no documented objection to this idea from President Abraham Lincoln. They didn't care. When you're high up, they don't care. So here, just to sum it up, this is the injustice. Only Andersonville in the South has been enshrined and has become a memorial to American POWs of all wars that involved American veterans. No war crimes or charges against Northern POW commandants were ever made, and no Northern POW camp has ever been enshrined by the U.S. government as a memorial to Confederate POWs. This is the injustice, and this is ongoing to this day. People do not, you see, one of the things people are probably making a little bit of a mistake, and it's not my, method to go down this trail. Sometimes people are talking about heritage and history. Well, I'm talking about justice, and I'm talking about defamatory language against a noble people and an honorable people in the South that fought for just cause, for independence. Because what it really boils down to is if they succeed in knocking down the South even further, the next step is to knock down America and all your rights. That's really what's going on here. You got to remember that this is not exactly a northern versus southern thing per se. It's more like a power-hungry, material, money-grabbing side versus an honorable, righteous, spiritual side. That's really what's going on. There's people in the North that are honorable, spiritual, and justice-minded, as there are in the South. But if you get down to the inner core of the money, it's really located in New York City, around that area, Washington, D.C., and unfortunately, in the occupied city of Atlanta, Georgia. Actually in the metropolitan area of Georgia, not the surrounding area of Georgia, but just in that metropolitan area, which is actually running roughshod over the rest of Georgia. But, the wheels of justice, I think, are going to be turning very slow here. But we need to wake up the American population to what types of injustices are actually going on. You see, the South suffered a Holocaust. The black population suffered a Holocaust. The black freed slaves, newly freed slaves, 25% of them died within, I think it was 8 years of being freed, due to the policies of the North. Not just, they were put in contraband camps. And if you look at, I don't have the reference right in front of me, and I didn't bother to put it out for this video because it wasn't part of this, but that actually is coming from a New England professor. Not a Southern professor or Confederate professor or a New England professor. And if I dig that out, I'll put it in the comments down below. But there was a Holocaust against the South, and actually even to this day, there's an attempt right now. It's not just about the memorials, it's about control. It's control. And if you really want to know what really went on, the history is there today. And there's still an ongoing financial interest to lie about why the South tried to break away. It's ongoing to this day. Because the same groups are still connected, even by DNA, I'm talking about the money people, to what they are the entrenched power of the day right now. Right now. So, I look at it like this. The population needs to be woken up. The northern population needs to be woken up. It's not an anti-northern thing. It's actually an anti-robber baron northern thing. That's the type of people that don't have anybody's interest in mind. They actually act like they are doing everybody a favor, but they hide really behind their fake philanthropy many times. So, one of the things to deflect away from some of the crimes by the money people is to throw a lot of dirt on the South. That's one of the methods. It's one of the methods. But obviously, when you're looking at the injustices that happened 150-something years ago, it's not just that. It's like, okay, they're thinking it's so important to tear down statues of Confederate, war heroes. Why? Because they've been lied about all these years, and they keep adding and adding and adding to these lies, because today there's still the same money interests, have the same rackets, and the same specious reasons to keep those rackets going. So, let's hope that justice does prevail eventually. I don't know if it can, but hopefully it can. So, just want to present this. Andersonville was a horror story, but again, the Confederates offered to even release the prisoners without exchange. The Union wouldn't even take them. Why? I could only guess why. It would look like they wanted to use this as more propaganda, why the South was evil and all this. The South was starving. The South didn't have food. The South didn't have medical supplies. The North was flush with food and medical supplies. The death rate of the Southern Confederate POWs was the same as of the Union POWs in the Confederate camps was the same as the Confederate Guards. Confederate Guards were dying of the same thing. They're all suffering. In the North, they had plenty. Hellmira, New York, was untouched, or Hellmira, as the South called it, by the war. There was food in abundance. There was a railroad hub center where anything could be brought in, medical supplies. Yet they sold tickets to the population so they could gape at the starving, suffering Confederate POWs. They sold tickets for profit. I mean, there's no comparison. And they're telling you the South is the evil ones? Somehow when I look at this, picture of justice is blind. Obviously justice is blind, because this should not be going on today. There should be Confederate memorials in the North, and they should be paid for by these robber barons that have profited by Southern suffering for all these years. I'll leave you with that thought. Over and out.